Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Ainan's Forensic Classroom. In the previous video, we looked at what happens to the evidence at the crime scene, how it is collected, packaged, and labeled correctly before it leaves the crime scene. But the story doesn't end here, because once the evidence leaves the crime scene, a whole new responsibility begins. It has to be stored properly, it has to be preserved correctly, protected from damage, contamination, and loss. And for months or sometimes even years later, that same piece of evidence may end up in a courtroom where everything investigators did is examined and questioned. So in this final video of our 7S series, we are going to follow the journey of evidence after it leaves the crime scene and see what it takes to preserve its value all the way from the crime scene to the courtroom. So let's talk about the evidence preservation and storage. Now, here's something that many students don't think about. Now, evidence collected at a crime scene, it does not go straight into the courtroom the next day. In fact, it may sit in the secure storage for months or even years, right, before a case finally goes to a trial. And during all that time, the evidence must remain in the same condition in which it was collected. That is the whole purpose of evidence preservation, to keep the evidence stable, to keep it uncontaminated, and keep it unchanged from the moment it is collected until the day it is presented in court. But preserving evidence isn't as simple as putting everything on the shelf and locking the door. Different types of evidence face different threats. Some are damaged by heat, some are damaged by moisture, some by light, others can degrade because of bacterial growth or chemical reactions. That is why there is no single storage method for every type of evidence. Now, the way the evidence is stored, it always depends on what the evidence is and what could potentially damage it. Let's talk about the cold storage, right? Now, let's talk about the biological evidences. Now, imagine you have collected a blood sample perfectly, you have packaged it correctly, you have labeled everything, but if that sample isn't stored properly afterwards, all that hard work can go to waste. That's why your biological samples like blood, saliva, tissue samples are often kept in cold storage. Now, the reason is very simple. Over time, bacteria, heat, moisture, it can start breaking it down. Cold storage temperatures slow that process and it helps preserve the DNA for future testing. Now, if you have to keep it for a short term storage, the biological evidences usually are kept in refrigerated units at around 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. For long-term preservation, the samples are stored in freezers at minus 20 degrees Celsius or below. Now, this is where DNA can remain stable for much longer periods. But there's one important step that comes before any of that. That is, the sample has to be dried properly first. If moisture gets trapped inside the package, it can encourage bacterial growth and it can damage the evidence over time. Now let's talk about the dry storage. Not all evidences needs refrigeration or freezing. Now evidences like documents or clothing or firearms or tools and any other non-biological evidence, these are usually kept in dry, climate controlled storage areas, right? Now when we say climate controlled, we simply mean that the temperature and humidity have to be kept stable, right? Now, this matters more than you might think. Now, imagine you have a document which is being exposed to constant changes in humidity. Now, over time, the paper can absorb moisture, it will dry out again and continue expanding and contracting. That can damage the document, it can affect the evidence present on the surface. Now, the same idea applies to the metal evidence. Your firearms, knives, and any other metal objects can be affected by moisture and it may begin to corrode or rust over time, right? Now, if that happens, important details such as tool marks or surface features or even serial numbers can become harder to examine. That is why non biological evidence is stored in clean, dry, controlled conditions designed to keep it in the same state as the day it was collected. Now, preventing contamination during storage. Now, here's something that students often forget. Now, evidence can still be contaminated even after it has been collected and packaged correctly. That's why evidence storage facilities have very strict rules. Now, to begin with, evidence from different cases has to be kept separate. Each item remain in its own sealed package with its own label, and investigators never mix the evidences from different cases. Then the access to stored evidence is also tightly controlled. Only authorized personnel are allowed to handle or remove evidence, and every movement of that evidence is documented. And finally, evidence isn't simply placed on a shelf and forgotten. No, periodic checks are carried out to make sure the packages remain sealed, labels are intact, and everything is exactly where it should be. Now, the goal is very simple. Once the evidence enters storage, it should remain protected, traceable, and unchanged until the day it is needed again. Now let's talk about the evidence in court. And see, this is where we arrive at the final destination of every piece of evidence, which is the courtroom. Now, if you think about it, everything we have covered in the entire 7S series, it leads us to this moment, securing the scene, taking photographs, making sketches, searching, collecting, packaging. All of it is done so that the evidence can stand up in the court. When evidence reaches a courtroom, two questions become extremely important. First one is the evidence admissible? Now, in simple term, admissibility means that the court accepts the evidence and allows it to be considered during the case. If the evidence was collected improperly, if it is contaminated or handled in a way that raises serious doubts about its reliability, its value may be challenged. The second one is, can the evidence be authenticated? Now, authentication simply means that proving that the item presented in the court of law is the same item that was collected from the crime scene. Now, in other words, can investigators show where it came from or how it was handled and that it remained unchanged throughout the investigation? That is why documentation matters so much in forensic science. Your photos, notes, labels, evidence logs, chain of custody record, all that help demonstrate that the evidence is genuine and has been handled properly from the crime scene to the courtroom. Now, evidence doesn't become valuable because it was found. It becomes valuable because investigators can prove it was collected, it was preserved, and handled correctly every step of the way. Now let's talk about your role in the courtroom. Now, if you're working as a crime scene investigator, there's something important you need to understand. When you are called to the court, you are there as the fact witness, not an expert witness. What does that mean? It means that you testify about what you personally saw and what you personally did. You explain where the evidence was found, how it was collected, how it was packaged, and what happened to it afterwards. You stick to the facts, right, as a crime scene investigator. Now, what is an expert witness? It has a different role. For example, a DNA analyst or a forensic pathologist or a ballistic expert is asked to interpret the result and explain what the evidence means. As a crime scene investigator, your responsibility is to explain how the evidence was handled, not what the conclusions should be drawn from it. And yes, your work may be questioned in the court of law. Lawyers may ask about your collection methods, your documentation, or whether proper procedures were followed. That's completely normal. Now, the key is very simple. You have to stay calm, you have to answer honestly, and rely on your documentation. In many ways, the paperwork you complete at the crime scene becomes just as important as the evidence itself, because when your documentation is accurate and complete, you can confidently explain and defend every step you took during that investigation. And with that, we have reached the end of 7S framework of the crime scene investigation. Seriously, just think about how much we have covered together. Step by step, you have seen how a crime scene investigation actually works, from the moment investigators arrive to the moment evidence is presented in the court of law. Now, if this series helped you understand forensic science a little better, please hit that like button. It takes just a second, but it genuinely helps these videos reach more students. And if you have been watching the series but haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and subscribe and officially become part of this little forensic science family. And please share these videos with your classmates, juniors, seniors, your study groups, anyone who's struggling with the forensic science. Because if there's one thing I want this channel to do, it's to make forensic science easier to understand and a lot less intimidating. But also, we are not completely done yet. There's still one final video left, because after the scene has been secured, searched, and every piece of evidence has been collected, there's one big question that still remains, which is what actually happened, right? Now, that is exactly what we will answer in our next video on crime scene reconstruction. I'll see you in the next video. Till then, take care. Bye bye.